In a cave in Valencia, Spain, there is a painting on a wall that is approximately 8,000 years old. It shows a human figure climbing a rope ladder toward a hole in a rock face, reaching into a swarm of bees, and pulling out a honeycomb. The figure has no shoes. The bees are drawn as frantic dark lines surrounding the intruder. And you can tell, even from 8,000 years of distance, that this person is fully aware of what they are risking and has decided the honey is worth it anyway. That painting is the oldest known depiction of a human being doing something deliberate with food. Not hunting. Not farming. Not fishing. Climbing into a bee swarm to steal what was inside. And what is remarkable is not just the age of the image. What is remarkable is how little the basic situation has changed. That same exchange, human risk, bee fury, golden reward, played out in every civilization on Earth for the next 8 millennia. Honey was the first sweetener, the first preservative, the first medicine, the first luxury good, the first form of taxation, and the first thing powerful men demanded when they wanted to demonstrate their power. Entire economies ran on it. Wars were partly funded by it. Gods required it as an offering. Wounds were packed with it on battlefields. The dead were preserved in it. The living fermented it into the oldest alcoholic drink in human history. And then, in the span of roughly 300 years, it lost. Sugar came, and honey went from being the most valuable food substance on Earth to being a topping for toast. The story of how that happened, how one sweetener dethroned another after 8,000 years of total dominance, touches the slave trade, the collapse of medieval economies, the rewriting of medicine, the rise of colonial empires, and the transformation of human taste itself. It starts, as almost everything important does, not with kings or empires, but with an ordinary creature doing an ordinary thing in an ordinary field, completely unaware that what it was producing would shape the entire course of human history. Before there was a honey industry, before there were beekeepers, before there were clay pots and carved combs and religious rituals and medical texts, there were just bees. The honeybee, Apis mellifera, has been producing honey for approximately 35 million years. It did not evolve to feed humans. It evolved to feed itself. Honey is, at its biological core, the bee colony's winter survival strategy. Worker bees collect nectar from flowering plants, carry it back to the hive in a special stomach called the honey stomach, pass it to other workers who chew it and break down the complex sugars, then deposit it into wax cells and fan it with their wings until most of the water evaporates. What remains is honey, a concentrated, shelf-stable, antimicrobial substance that the colony draws on during the cold months when nothing is blooming. The antimicrobial property is critical, and it is worth pausing on because it explains almost everything that follows about why humans became so obsessed with this particular substance. Honey does not spoil. Not in a year. Not in a decade. Not in a century. Archaeologists excavating Egyptian tombs have found sealed honey pots that were still edible after 3,000 years. The chemistry behind this sounds almost engineered. Honey has a water content low enough to prevent microbial growth. It contains hydrogen peroxide, released slowly by an enzyme called glucose oxidase. Its pH sits between 3.2 and 4.5, which is acidic enough to kill most bacteria. And its sugar concentration is so high that it draws water out of any bacterial cell that contacts it, killing it through osmosis. This was not designed for humans. But humans noticed. And once they noticed, they never really let go. The Valencia cave painting is the oldest visual evidence, but it is not the oldest evidence of human honey consumption. Beeswax residue has been found on pottery fragments from sites across the Middle East and Europe dating back 9,000 years. Which means that by the time someone thought to paint a picture of honey hunting, humans had already been collecting it long enough to develop specialized containers for storage. The leap from honey hunting, climbing into wild bee colonies and taking their stores, to beekeeping is one of the most consequential technological developments in early human history, and it is still not entirely understood when it happened or where it happened first. What we do know is that by 3000 BC, ancient Egypt had a fully developed beekeeping industry. Egyptian hieroglyphics show horizontal clay cylinders stacked in rows. These were hives. Workers are shown blowing smoke to calm the bees, the same technique that beekeepers use today. The pharaoh's official title included a bee symbol. The Egyptian word for beekeeper appears in administrative records as a formal occupation with a salary and a rank in the government hierarchy. Honey flowed through the Egyptian economy as both food and currency. Tax records show that honey was among the goods collected from subject territories. Temple offerings required it. Medical papyri from 2700 BC, some of the oldest medical documents ever found, list honey as an ingredient in over 500 remedies. It was prescribed for eye infections, wound infections, gut problems, and skin diseases.
Given what we now know about honey's antimicrobial properties, many of those prescriptions were almost certainly effective.
The Egyptians also used honey as a preservative for the dead. Ancient Greek and Roman sources describe the bodies of important people being submerged in honey to preserve them for transport or burial. Alexander the Great, according to some ancient accounts, was preserved in a golden sarcophagus filled with white honey after his death in Babylon in 323 BC, his body transported back to Alexandria in a state that allowed his generals and the public to view him. Whether or not that specific account is accurate, the practice it describes was real and documented. Honey was, for ancient people, the closest thing to a substance that defeated time. It kept food from rotting, kept wounds from festering, kept the dead from decomposing. For a civilization without refrigeration, without antibiotics, without embalming chemicals, this was essentially miraculous.
And here is where the economics become extraordinary.
Because a substance with that many applications, food, medicine, preservative, ritual offering, currency, is not just valuable.
It is indispensable.
Every civilization that developed in the ancient world developed a relationship with honey that went far beyond eating it.
They built institutions around it.
If you want to understand how central honey was to ancient culture, start with what ancient people made when they had access to it and water and time.
Mead is a fermented drink made from honey and water.
It is the oldest alcoholic beverage in human history, predating wine, predating beer, predating every other fermented drink that human civilization has produced. Residue analysis of pottery from a site in China dated to approximately 7000 BC shows evidence of a fermented honey-based drink. Evidence of mead production appears in archaeological sites across northern Europe, the Middle East, and sub-Saharan Africa. The word for mead appears in Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor language of nearly every European language, which means the concept of honey wine is older than Latin, older than Greek, older than Sanskrit.
It is one of the oldest words in the entire Indo-European language family. In the Norse tradition, mead was not just a drink. It was a divine substance.
The myth of the mead of poetry describes a magical mead brewed from the blood of a being of perfect wisdom, mixed with honey.
Whoever drank it gained the ability to compose perfect poetry and speak perfect wisdom. The mead was fought over by gods and giants. Odin himself risked death to steal it. This was not a story about a nice drink at a feast. This was a story about the most precious thing in the universe, and honey was its primary ingredient. The Greeks had ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods. Classical scholars have long argued that these substances were, in origin, descriptions of honey and honey-based drinks. The word ambrosia shares a root with the Latin word for immortality. The food of the gods that made them immortal was, in the Greek imagination, something that tasted like honey and looked like honey and preserved things the way honey preserved things. The Hindu tradition has the Panchamrita, a sacred mixture of 5 substances used in religious ritual. Honey is one of the 5.
The others are milk, yogurt, ghee, and sugar, but in the oldest versions of the ritual, before refined sugar was widely available, honey appears in sugar's place. In the Jewish tradition, the Promised Land is described as a land flowing with milk and honey, not wheat, not wine, not oil, but honey. The imagery recurs throughout the Torah as the ultimate symbol of abundance and divine favor. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, bread and apples are dipped in honey as a symbol of hope for a sweet year ahead. That tradition is thousands of years old and it persists today. In almost every ancient civilization that left records, honey was sacred. Not metaphorically sacred, not culturally sacred, but ritually, institutionally, structurally sacred. Temples required it. Gods demanded it. Kings were anointed with it. This was not decoration. This was the operating logic of early human religion. And the reason honey became sacred was the same reason it became economically central. It was the sweetest thing most humans would ever taste, it did not spoil, and it appeared to come from nowhere, produced by a creature that no one fully understood, from flowers, through a process that seemed more like alchemy than biology. If you had been a European peasant in the 12th century and someone asked you what the sweetest thing in the world tasted like, you would have said honey. There was no other answer available. Sugar existed. It had been cultivated in New Guinea for approximately 10,000 years, domesticated in India around 350 BC, and refined into a crystalline substance by Indian chemists by roughly 500 AD. But in medieval Europe, refined cane sugar was an exotic import, arriving via Arab trade routes in quantities so small and at prices so high that it was classified as a spice stored with pepper and cinnamon and nutmeg in locked boxes in wealthy households, and dispensed in pinches by apothecaries as a medicine. Honey was the sweetener that built medieval European cuisine, medicine, and economy.
The monasteries of medieval Europe were the centers of beekeeping knowledge and production. Monks kept bees for two reasons. First, honey sweetened their food and fermented into mead.
But the second reason was, in terms of sheer institutional importance, more critical.
Beeswax made candles. And candles were not a luxury in a monastery.
They were an operational requirement. The liturgy required light at hours when natural light was not available. Every mass, every canonical hour from vigils at midnight to compline at night, required candles. And beeswax candles were superior to tallow candles, they burned cleaner, they burned longer, they didn't drip as badly, and they didn't smell like rendered animal fat during worship. So monasteries kept bees to make candles to hold services. The honey was, in a sense, the byproduct. But it was a byproduct so valuable that it structured the entire agricultural economy surrounding the monastery. Lords demanded honey as rent. Not occasionally, not symbolically, but systematically. English historical records from the Domesday Book of 1086 show dozens of entries where tenant farmers owed their lord a specific number of cesters of honey per year as part of
their land payment. In some regions, honey renders were among the most common form of non-cash rent in the early medieval economy. Mead halls were not just literary settings from Beowulf.
They were real architectural features of Anglo-Saxon noble life. The lord of a territory hosted his warriors and retainers in a hall where mead was distributed as a form of social bonding, loyalty demonstration, and political obligation. The lord who ran out of mead had a credibility problem. The lord who had abundant mead was projecting wealth, stability, and generosity simultaneously. Mead, therefore, was political. The honey trade supported not just local economies but long-distance commerce. Baltic honey, produced in the vast forests of what is now Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, became one of the most important export goods in medieval northern Europe.
German Hanseatic merchants traded Baltic honey across the entire European continent.
Records from the Hanseatic League show honey listed alongside cloth, timber, and salt as a primary commodity in the northern European trading system. And all of this, the monasteries, the mead halls, the Hanseatic traders, the rent rolls, the apothecaries dispensing sugar as spice, was functioning at full power and had been for centuries, when the thing that would eventually destroy it was already growing quietly in a different part of the world.
If you are finding this fascinating, hit subscribe.
Every day we cover stories like this one, where something ordinary turns out to have quietly shaped the entire modern world.
The sugarcane plant, Saccharum officinarum, is a tropical grass that originated in New Guinea and spread through human cultivation across South and Southeast Asia over thousands of years. The process of extracting and crystallizing sugar from sugarcane, creating what we would recognize as refined sugar, was developed in India sometime around 500 AD and spread west through the Persian Empire and then into the Arab world following the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Arab agriculturalists brought sugar cultivation to the Mediterranean, to Sicily, to Cyprus, to the southern coast of Spain. Medieval crusaders encountering it in the Middle East brought back reports of a remarkable substance they described as a new kind of spice. By the 13th century, Venice had established itself as the primary European hub for the sugar trade, importing refined sugar from Arab producers and distributing it at enormous markup across the continent. But this was still specialty commerce. Sugar was still a spice. Still medicine. Still locked in wealthy cabinets. The honey economy was intact. What ended it was geography, colonialism, and a catastrophic moral decision that would stay in the next 3 centuries of human history. When Portuguese sailors began exploring the west coast of Africa in the early 15th century and eventually reached the uninhabited islands of the Atlantic, Madeira, the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands, they found something remarkable. A tropical climate in the Atlantic, close enough to Europe to make regular shipping practical, with fertile volcanic soil that could grow sugarcane at scale. The Portuguese planted sugarcane in Madeira in the 1420s. By the 1450s, Madeira sugar was reaching European markets in quantities large enough to drive prices down for the first time. By the end of the 15th century, Madeira was the largest producer of sugar in the Western world. And then Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, and everything accelerated past the point of control. The Caribbean, and then Brazil, and then the entire tropical belt of the Americas had climate conditions ideal for sugarcane production at a scale that the Mediterranean islands could not match. What the Spanish and Portuguese and later the Dutch, French, and British discovered was that the New World could produce sugar in essentially unlimited quantities, if you had the labor to work it. Sugarcane cultivation was brutal work. The cane had to be planted, harvested by hand with machetes, immediately crushed to extract the juice before it fermented, boiled down in enormous vats in insufferable heat, and processed through multiple stages of crystallization.
The work could not stop, it could not be mechanized with the technology of the time, and it killed people at a staggering rate. In the heat and humidity of a Caribbean sugar plantation, laborers died from exhaustion, disease, and accident at rates that made most other colonial labor systems look moderate by comparison. The solution that European colonial powers reached, and it was a solution reached deliberately, cynically, and with full knowledge of what it meant, was the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1500 and 1900, approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. Of those, historians estimate that somewhere between 60% and 70% went to sugar-producing territories. Sugar was not the only driver of the slave trade, but it was the primary driver. The plantation system that defined the Atlantic slave trade was, in its basic economic logic, a system built to produce cheap sweetener for European consumers. And it worked. By the 17th century, sugar prices in Europe had dropped so far from their medieval highs that what had been a spice available only to royalty and the wealthy was becoming accessible to the growing middle class. By the 18th century, the average English person was consuming several pounds of sugar per year. By the mid-19th century, that figure had risen to over 40 pounds per year. Sugar had gone from exotic luxury to staple commodity in the span of 3 centuries, and the cost of that transformation was paid not by the European consumers who benefited from it, but by millions of enslaved people on the other side of the Atlantic. Honey could not compete with this. Not economically. Not at scale. A beekeeper could maintain a certain number of hives, in a certain geographic range, producing a certain amount of honey per season. Sugarcane plantations powered by enslaved labor could produce sugar in quantities that made the medieval honey economy look artisanal. The price gap widened every decade. By the 1700s, sugar was cheaper than honey in most European markets. By the 1800s, it wasn't even close. Honey's 8,000-year reign as the world's primary sweetener ended not because it was inferior, but because it was produced by insects on their own schedule and sugar was produced by enslaved human beings on the schedule of European markets. The displacement of honey by sugar was not clean. It was not a simple substitution. Because honey was not just food. It was a structural element of an entire civilization, and when it lost its economic primacy, the structures that had been built around it began to collapse or transform. The mead economy died first. By the 17th century, wine and beer, both of which could be produced more cheaply than mead once grain and grapes were readily available, had already been competing with mead for centuries. But mead had survived because honey was a prestige product and mead was a prestige drink. When sugar prices dropped and honey retained its relatively high cost of production, the economics of mead ceased to make sense for anyone other than hobbyists and traditionalists. By the 18th century, mead had essentially vanished from mainstream European drinking culture. It survived in pockets, in parts of Wales, in Ethiopia, where tej, a honey wine, remains culturally central to this day, and in Poland, where the tradition of drinking honey wine called Mead Pitney persisted. But the mead halls of the Anglo-Saxon world, the Viking feast traditions, the divine beverage of Norse mythology, all of it faded into history within a few generations of sugar becoming affordable. The medical use of honey underwent a different kind of collapse. As modern medicine developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, honey's role in wound care and disease treatment was not exactly disproven, it was simply classified as folk medicine, as tradition, as the kind of thing your grandmother believed. The germ theory of disease, the development of antiseptics, the eventual discovery of antibiotics, each advance made honey's antimicrobial properties seem redundant. If you had iodine, why use honey? If you had penicillin, why use honey? The irony, which we will return to, is that honey was actually working all along for exactly the reasons modern science eventually explained. But for roughly a century and a half, medical science and popular culture agreed that honey was what people used before they had real medicine. The monastic beekeeping economy largely collapsed following the Protestant Reformation. When Henry VIII dissolved the English monasteries between 1536 and 1541, he eliminated hundreds of institutional beekeeping operations at a stroke. Across Protestant Northern Europe, the Reformation disrupted the candle economy that had made beekeeping institutionally necessary. Fewer liturgical candles meant fewer bees needed to be kept, which meant less honey produced, which meant less knowledge maintained and transmitted. The knowledge of beekeeping did not disappear. But it fragmented. What had been institutional and systematic became individual and informal. The sophisticated bee management techniques that monasteries had developed over centuries had to be rediscovered and systematized again when beekeeping science revived in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the honey trade itself, the Baltic honey that had flowed through Hanseatic networks across medieval Europe, quietly contracted. Not in one dramatic moment but gradually, over generations, as the commodity that had made Baltic forest honey valuable was replaced by something cheaper, whiter, and infinitely more scalable coming from the other side of the world.
By 1800, honey was no longer an economy. It was a commodity. A secondary commodity.
Something you put in tea if you preferred it to sugar, or used in specific baked goods where the flavor was desired, or kept in a jar for a sore throat because your grandmother had told you to. The vast civilizational apparatus that had been built around it, the temples, the tax rolls, the trade routes, the mead halls, the monastery hives, had all, in the span of 3 centuries, been dismantled and forgotten. In 1963, a New Zealand scientist named Peter Molen began studying the antimicrobial properties of honey. This was not a particularly prestigious research area at the time. Honey as medicine was the kind of thing that serious researchers were not supposed to take seriously. But Molen was stubborn and rigorous, and what he found over the following decades was astonishing. Not all honey is equally antimicrobial. Most of honey's antibacterial effect comes from the hydrogen peroxide released by glucose oxidase, but this enzyme is deactivated by heat, light, and bodily fluids. In wound care applications, regular honey's antimicrobial punch fades relatively quickly. But Molen found that honey produced by bees foraging on the Leptospermum scoparium plant, the manuka bush native to New Zealand and parts of Australia, had a different kind of antibacterial activity. One that did not fade when the hydrogen peroxide component was neutralized. One that persisted in wound environments. One that was effective against bacteria that were increasingly resistant to conventional antibiotics. The active compound was eventually identified as methylglyoxal, or MGO. Manuka honey contains it in concentrations far higher than conventional honeys. And its antibacterial properties are, in clinical trials, effective against a range of serious bacterial pathogens, including Staphylococcus aureus, Helicobacter pylori, and clinical strains that are resistant to conventional antibiotics. In 2004, a Manuka honey wound dressing was licensed for clinical use in the European Union. In 2007, the United States FDA approved a Manuka honey wound care product for clinical use in American hospitals. The substance that ancient Egyptians had packed into wounds 4,000 years ago, that medieval apothecaries had prescribed until penicillin made it seem obsolete, that modern medicine had dismissed as grandmother's remedy, had been formally readmitted into clinical practice as a legitimate medical tool. And the market responded. Manuka honey, which requires specific plants, specific bees, specific climate conditions, and rigorous testing to verify its MGO concentration, became one of the most expensive food products on Earth. Authentic high-grade Manuka honey sells for prices that range from $50 to over $500 per kilogram depending on potency rating. The global Manuka honey market was valued at approximately $900 million in 2022 and is projected to reach over $1.3 billion by 2028. Which means that honey has, in a very specific and medically validated corner of the market, done something extraordinary. It has found a value proposition that industrial sugar cannot touch, and reclaimed economic territory that it appeared to have lost forever. The bees were right about the chemistry all along. It just took humans about 150 years of having antibiotics before they paid attention again. Today, global honey production sits at approximately 1.9 million metric tons per year. China is the world's largest producer by a significant margin, accounting for roughly 30% of global output. Other major producers include Turkey, Iran, Argentina, and the United States. Global honey trade generates revenues of around $9 billion annually, significant, but a fraction of the $100 billion plus global sugar market. In absolute terms, honey never recovered its dominant position. Sugar won. Sugar is cheaper, more stable, more easily standardized, more easily incorporated into industrial food manufacturing, and, for most applications, perfectly adequate as a sweetener. The 8,000 years of honey's reign could not survive the economics of plantation agriculture and the Atlantic slave trade. But honey's story did not end with its displacement. It transformed. In agriculture, bees are now valued not primarily for honey but for pollination. Approximately 1/3 of all human food production depends on pollinator activity. Almonds in California require bees so completely that the almond industry supports a commercial pollination system where beekeepers truck millions of hive boxes across the country every year. Without bees, not just honey but the entire structure of fruit, vegetable, and nut agriculture begins to collapse. The bee that was once valued for what it produced is now understood to be valuable for the ecological service it performs. And that service is under threat. Colony collapse disorder, first formally described in 2006, has caused the loss of billions of honeybee colonies worldwide. The causes are complex and still debated: pesticide exposure, habitat loss, parasites, pathogens, stress from commercial migration of hives, but the consequences are straightforward. Fewer bees means less pollination, which means less food, which means a potential food security crisis that dwarfs anything that could be solved by finding a cheaper sweetener.
The creature that
painted ancient humans on cave walls as intruders worth stinging, the creature that built the economies of ancient Egypt and medieval Europe, the creature whose product was stolen by climbing ancestors 8,000 years ago, now faces its own crisis of survival. And the humans who once organized entire civilizations around its honey are only beginning to understand that what they are at risk of losing is not the sweetness. It is something much more fundamental than that. Walk through any upscale grocery store today and count the varieties of honey available. Acacia honey, wildflower honey, buckwheat honey, orange blossom honey, clover honey, raw honey, creamed honey, comb honey, and sitting separately in its own premium section with its own certification rating system, Manuka honey. The person who put that Manuka honey on the shelf is, in a direct line of commercial inheritance, doing something that the monks of 12th century England did, that the Egyptian beekeepers of 3000 BC did, that the person painted on a cave wall in Valencia did 8,000 years ago. Harvesting a substance produced by a creature for its own survival and finding it so remarkable, so sweet, so stable, so medically useful, so irreplaceable in certain contexts that it organizes human behavior around it.
The cave painter had no concept of antimicrobial chemistry.
The Egyptian temple worker who poured honey onto a sacred altar had no concept of methylglyoxal. The Anglo-Saxon lord who filled his mead hall with the smell of fermented honey had no concept of a global commodity market. The medieval monk who tended his monastery hives had no concept of the sugar plantations being established on Atlantic islands that would eventually make his honey economically irrelevant. And none of them knew what that honey would eventually prove to be: a substance old enough that it predates human civilization by millions of years, sophisticated enough that it still outperforms modern antiseptics in certain clinical applications, and culturally embedded deeply enough that after 300 years of being displaced, marginalized, and dismissed, it is still on your shelf.
Still amber. Still sweet.
Still made the same way it was made 35 million years ago. The bee, for its part, has never changed its process. It collects nectar, it processes it, it evaporates the water, it seals the cells with wax, and it waits. It has been doing this for longer than our species has existed.
It will very likely
be doing it long after the sugar trade, the grocery store, and the premium food market are historical footnotes that future civilizations will find puzzling and remarkable.
What is harder to know is whether the humans will still be there to climb up and take it.
If you made it this far, you just learned something that almost no one talks about: how the sweetener sitting in your kitchen has one of the most consequential histories on Earth. Subscribe for more stories like this.
New video every week.